Also on the show is Putin, the uncrowned king of West Asia now. He has a finger in every pie and is calling the shots in Syria. India trains Afghan women soldiers at a military academy in Chennai. A WION special report coming up. The last lap of what became a bitter battle for prestige. Campaigning winds up in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's home state of Gujarat today. And India spends $9 billion every year on arms, making it the world's largest weapons importer. The details of a new study coming up. But first to West Asia. 5 days after US President Donald Trump declared that his country recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, street protests and violence have finally subsided to a certain extent, but diplomatic battles continue and by the looks of it will be long drawn. Our top story tonight looks at how India should leverage this crisis to cement its role as a global leader.
Donald Trump's decision to shift the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to the contested holy city of Jerusalem definitely shook the world. It outraged and humiliated Palestinians who have been fighting against what they call an Israeli colonialist and military occupation for decades. It emboldened the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and many Israelis who see Jerusalem as their capital city as a historical and religious right. What happens in Jerusalem does not stay in Jerusalem. The Arab League held an emergency meeting, and so did the United Nations and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
We agree on the two-state solution, a Palestinian state with the 1967 borders and capital in East Jerusalem, and the Israeli state. The decision of President Trump is completely unacceptable. We think that the US, by taking this stance, has renounced its political role in the Middle East.
Other players in the region were also critical.
Russia and Turkey consider the decision by the United States to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel and to transfer the American embassy to this city does not help the resolution of the situation in the Middle East. It destabilizes the region. It crosses out any prospect of Israeli-Palestinian peace.
With their decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the United States has become a partner in this bloodshed. We don't recognize this decision, we never will.
But the current state of affairs could open the door for other global players to take the lead and find alternative solutions for the Israel-Palestine conflict. For instance, India, which is a traditional supporter of the Palestinian cause, but in recent years has emerged as Israel's most strategic partner in the subcontinent. The loss of credibility of the US could give India the chance to present itself as a reliable mediator. Both the Palestinians and Israel would likely welcome India's role. Delhi is not engaged in any sectarian or political battle in West Asia. It has good relations with both sides. Prime Minister Narendra Modi wants to transform India into a global power. China has already started the game. On the Jerusalem issue, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, I quote, China firmly supports and advances the Middle East peace process. We support the just cause of the Palestinian people to restore their legitimate national rights and stand behind Palestine in building an independent, full sovereignty state along the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. India's reaction was not as neat as this. India's position on Palestine is independent and consistent. It is shaped by our views and interests and not determined by other countries. In early November, China proposed to mediate between Israel and Palestine. In an interview to the Chinese agency Xinhua, the country's special envoy on the Middle East affairs, Gong Xiaoseng, traveled to Cairo, and there he presented a 4-point program by President Xi Jinping to solve the dispute. As diplomatically complicated as it may be, India could pitch itself as a guarantor of the two-people, two-state solution. It is a global aim for a country aiming at the front row of the world politics. Daniele Pagani for WION.
And joining us this evening, Ambassador Arun Singh, former Indian ambassador both to the US and Israel. Mustafa Barghouti, General Secretary for Palestine National Initiative, joining us from Ramallah. Ibrahim Musa, Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the US. Sadanand Dhume, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute from Washington. And Arsen Ostrovsky, Political Analyst with us from Tel Aviv. Good evening to everyone. Ambassador Singh, let's begin with you. Is it time for India to drop the ambiguity. When the Prime Minister visited earlier this year, much was made of the fact that India is dropping the hypocrisy and coming out in the open. Shouldn't that be repeated here when Jerusalem is the single biggest geopolitical debate? India's statement leaves much to be asked for.
So when I read the Indian statement, I didn't see any ambiguity, because it says clearly that India's position is independent and consistent. Now, what do you mean by consistent? Because India's position has been, as has been the broad international norm and also following from the UN resolutions since 1967, that the dividing line, the internationally accepted dividing line between Israel and Palestinians, unless they work out any agreement between themselves, is the line as it existed before the 1967 conflict. And that is the position that India takes. And therefore, what President Trump has said goes beyond that, and clearly that is not consistent with India's position. And that's why in the Indian statement, it is said that we don't take positions based on what third countries have done. And again, because India has interests in all the countries and partners involved, the interest with the US, interest with Israel, interest with the Palestinians, it's important to, while affirming your position, take a very measured and balanced approach. And this is not the only time India has done it. If you look historically, for example, if you look at 1979, when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, the Indian statement at that time was a very measured, balanced one, keeping in mind India's interest with the Soviet Union. Or when for a couple of years ago there was Russia's action in Crimea related to Ukraine for historical reasons and other linkages that Crimea had with Russia. India again took a very measured position because of its relationship with Russia. Or when the US invaded Iraq in 2003. A lot of people then criticized the Indian government for not being very upfront, bold, and the then Prime Minister said that I do not believe in rhetorical diplomacy, but in effective diplomacy. So I think keeping in mind its interests with different countries involved, while maintaining your position, it's important to come out with a measured and a balanced statement.
Measured sounds like a euphemism for no position at all, because I'll quote from what the Ministry of External Affairs statement said. India's position on Palestine is independent and consistent. It is shaped by our views and interests and not determined by any third country. What does it say? But let me come to Sadanand Dhume. Is it time for India to take a more proactive role? India is, some would say, best poised to play the mediator at a time when America has undermined its own position and others, including China, are looking at a possible role.
So two quick responses. I mean, first is that I would agree with Ambassador saying that there was nothing particularly ambiguous about India's view. I think it's a perfectly reasonable position that India maintains its position regardless of what the United States has espoused on the issue. The second is I'm not sure it makes sense for India to jump into this very complicated, knotty issue at a particularly volatile time. I think on the contrary, the way India has been approaching the relationship with Israel has been sensible. Notice that under the Modi government, India has in fact sort of dialed back its position on Jerusalem a little bit. It's less stridently pro-Palestinian, but at the same time, it maintains relations with both countries while dramatically improving its relationship with Israel. That should be India's tack, and that tack can be continued without getting into any kind of leading position in brokering a negotiation in one of the world's most knotty issues.
Indeed. Arsen, earlier this year I travelled both to Jerusalem and to Ramallah and asked the stakeholders there and what they thought of a possible role for India. They said the question was moot, of course, because India wasn't offering and nobody had asked. But do you see a role for India, and how would that be received? How is India placed in this equation to talk to both the sides, vis-a-vis America, perhaps?
My comment, I actually just came back today from Jerusalem, and contrary to some reports in the media, following President Trump's announcement, I can confirm to you that the sky has not fallen down. Jerusalem has not burned down. It's actually was today a very beautiful, sunny day with blue skies, as Israelis and Jews around the world today are marking the holiday of Hanukkah, our festival of lights, which perhaps not ironically marks 2,000 years ago when we rededicated the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, of all places. With that little aside, I would suggest that I think from the Israelis' perspective, we would certainly most welcome greater involvement from India. India, not only just President Modi, but the Indian people, the Indian government, we have a great deal of respect to. His visit here earlier this year, a couple of months ago, was incredibly successful. From Israel's perspective, we look at the two countries with our shared, two big democracies with our shared goals and our focus on very sort of innovative, creative economies. I think Israel would certainly look positively for greater involvement from the Indian side. And I think we've seen over the last even 2 or so years being a much more positive stance from India towards Israel. We know that Rome wasn't built in a day, so this will take time. But whereas previously India may have reflexively sided with the Palestinians, we've seen a gradual change with votes at the UN that might have been a no and now been abstained. And I think, as we saw with the Indian statement on Jerusalem, was perhaps quite different to maybe some of the nations we've seen from the EU and from the rest of the international community. Was, I think, in all the circumstances, quite muted. So I do think that Israel would look quite favorably to greater involvement from India in the peace process overall.
Mustafa Barghouti, many in Palestine have said that America has lost the right to mediate in a dispute by taking sides and becoming party to it. Newer players are looking at a possible role. Where do you see India in this?
Well, first of all, the sky is not falling, but the Israeli army is killing Palestinians all over Palestine. Not only by territories, but even inside Israel. And one more thing, 151 countries refused what Trump announced. They are a very strong stand against declaring Jerusalem as a capital of Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu has just received very cold in the European Union, and he was told very clearly and bluntly by all European countries that we will not have this monopoly over Jerusalem. So the United States and Israel are in diplomatic defeat with them alone in front of 151 countries. Now, India has always had a very good relations with Palestinian people. India has always taken a very supportive position to the Palestinian people. Since Mahatma Gandhi, it was Mahatma Gandhi who criticized even the establishment of the State of Israel, because it hurt the interest and life of Palestinians who were displaced from their land. And since then, India has always taken a very strong position for the right of people. Now, if India wants to play a positive role and a more active role, they are most welcome, especially within the framework of an international conference, because the United States has lost its credibility completely. But I think India should be concerned with two issues. First of all, I hope that India will be always supportive of what international law says and what UN resolutions say. And international law says that occupation must end and apartheid is not allowed to continue by Israel against Palestinians. And second, I think it's very important not to equate between Palestinians and Israelis. You can't equate between an occupier and occupied, between an oppressor and oppressed, between somebody practicing a system of apartheid and discrimination and people who are subject to the system of discrimination and apartheid.
Okay, your voice
That's
is
why
breaking.
these two conditions are.
Sure.
I think India could play a very.
Mustafa Barghouti, your voice is breaking. I'll try and reconnect with you. I didn't want to break your chain of thought, and I'll paraphrase for the viewers what you've said, that you would welcome India's possible role, but you also hope that India is going to respect international law on this. Ambassador Singh, I'm going to come to you, but let me bring in the other guest here also, Professor Musa, who's joining us from Indiana. Professor Musa, what's your take on what's being discussed?
Missing one particular aspect, and that is that at the global level, that's something what states say and what governments are positioning themselves. So India has taken a particular position on this thing and prioritizing its own interests with the state of Israel, and also balancing those interests with its historical support for the Palestinian people. But at another level, there's also, popular outrage at various levels. Communities in India, in Pakistan, in different parts of the world, in North America and elsewhere, publics generally are also seeing that this maneuvering of global actors like the US, Russia, China, does not necessarily deliver on these very burning questions of justice for the Palestinians. And when they see on a basis the growing Israeli occupation and the stealing of Palestinian land, so you're going to see differences between India's very manicured position from New Delhi and also the opinion of people on the ground and the historical injustice that people experience globally about what happens to disempowered people. And I think we should not take out of the equation how that anger, how that dissatisfaction might express itself in different ways in days ahead. Unless actors like India and China and others come onto the scene and can be seen as credible negotiators and intermediaries to bring about the required justice in these difficult political situations, we should not take for granted that the sky has not fallen down or that there's not that level of anger that people are expected to see, but there's still a long road ahead. And we don't want these issues to take the form of a pathology where violence and other kinds of mechanisms become the order of the day.
Okay, for a moment, Ambassador Singh, let's keep aside what should be done and what shouldn't be done. What are the principles? What is international? Purely from New Delhi's point of view, when you say that you want to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, when you say that you want to assume a global leadership role, should you also not demonstrate the willingness to wade into such sticky issues and try to take that leadership role?
So you have to see where your role can be effective and in what way. And my own view is that we can make the most effective contribution to processes between Israel and Palestine by building good bilateral relationships, both with Israel and with the Palestinians, contributing to processes of economic cooperation, processes of development in Palestine, and help contribute to a manner in which the atmosphere of peace and development can succeed. Now, the Mustafa Barghouti had refers to India needing to follow the issue of international legitimacy. And I think when the spokesman said that our position is consistent with the UN resolutions, is consistent with the broad international legitimacy. And that's why India's position tends to be measured, because even in 1992, when India opened its embassy in Israel and established full diplomatic relations, it did so only when a large number of countries internationally, after part of the Oslo peace process, started opening their embassy. So there has been an attempt here to keep in mind the international norm, legitimacy, and move with that. And the most important in terms of the role that you're saying, India's position in its own context has been that we do not welcome any kind of a third-party role, that we want issues that are between us and any other country to be resolved bilaterally. And therefore, consistent with that, our position would be that issues between Israel and Palestinians need to be resolved bilaterally. And others
I knew that was coming. I knew. But see, Jerusalem is not Kashmir. You've not said it, but I know what you're trying to say. And India has maintained this position, and rightly so, that this is a bilateral issue. But the players in West Asia haven't. So it's not the same dynamic and not the same equation. So I would be wary of comparing the two. But Sadanand Dume, we've seen China, for instance, in the case of Myanmar, India, some say, took a myopic view of what was happening. The Chinese moved in. Even a country like Singapore has made its stand very, very clear. These are issues that affect all of us. These are issues that affect this world. And so it seems that India is always wary. India is always waiting for the storm to pass before sort of making its position clear, and it shouldn't be doing, because this is an issue that has offered itself to India on a platter, as it were. India enjoys very good relations with both the stakeholders and can play a more constructive role than it already is.
I would actually agree with you on the Myanmar part, because the stakes for India are very immediate, and India sort of is in a position to do much more, and it affects India much more concretely and directly. I do not agree with you on the Israel question. I agree with Ambassador Singh. I think the more sensible route is to do what India is doing now, continue to build a strong relationship with the Israelis while maintaining ties with the Palestinians. There's another question also over here, which I think we haven't touched upon, which is that the domestic politics in India has changed to such an extent that in many ways the public, and particularly people who are inclined towards the BJP, are very, very clearly tilted on this entire question towards Israel. So, the traditional Indian position may have tilted a little bit more towards the Palestinians, becoming somewhat more even-handed after 1992. But if you look at sort of sentiment today, particularly among ruling party supporters, it would be very strongly in support of what President Donald Trump has declared. And some figures from within the ruling party have even suggested that India should follow suit. I'm not saying that necessarily. I'm just saying that this is a balancing act. And under these circumstances, given this sort of combination of the domestic politics and the volatile international situation, I'm not sure whether India performing a mediating role would be very welcome or wise.
Perhaps we'll hear a stronger statement after the Gujarat elections. Who knows? Politics also dictates a lot of decisions. But I'm out of time on this. Thanks very much. It was very good to have all of you here on the panel. Ambassador Singh, Mustafa Barghouti, Ibrahim Musa, Sadanand Dhume and Aston Ostrovsky. Thank you very much for joining us. And for our viewers, let's look at how India holds a rather unique position to play a leadership role in the Israel-Palestine dispute. Ties with Israel have flourished under the present administration, as some of our guests also outlined. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a groundbreaking trip to Israel earlier this year, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to arrive in New Delhi for a visit soon. This year, India signed 2 arms deals. The deal for Israeli missile defense systems was perhaps the most significant one. It is valued at more than $2 billion. India has strong ties with Palestine as well. India was the first non-Arab country to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization's authority to represent Palestinians. Palestine has an embassy in New Delhi. India has committed more than $30 million towards Palestine's development needs. Back in May, Palestine's President Mahmoud Abbas paid a visit to New Delhi and held talks with the Indian Prime Minister. And back then, India had offered its unwavering support to the Palestinian cause, throwing its weight behind the two-state solution. And this easy relationship with both the stakeholders gives India that unique vantage point that must be capitalized on, according to Gravitas, according to us. So what about the peace effort so far in the region? Let's also take a look at that. The peace process officially kicked off in 1993 after the Oslo Accords set a timetable for the peace talks. The accords were then signed by the then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. But Arafat rejected the peace offer made by Israel in 2001. Talks hit an impasse after both sides failed to reach an agreement, and the violence worsened during the second uprising or intifada in Palestine. Oslo Accords have set the framework for all peace talks since, with the United States acting as a mediator. But unfortunately, there has been no agreement. Successive administrations have tried to put their own spin to these accords. The Bush administration, for one, tried to introduce a roadmap, as they called it, to the peace talks. The Obama administration made the peace process a priority for its foreign policy initiative, and yet both failed. After President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Palestine has said that America has lost the right to play mediator. There are 4 issues, essentially, that continue to halt the peace process. These include the settlement of borders between Israel and the West Bank, Israeli security around the region, the relocation or repatriation of Palestinian refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. That's how things stand.